It's no secret that Amsterdam has a rich history, but some parts of its past are darker than others. While the canals, the bustling city streets, and the vibrant culture of the city have captivated people for centuries, there is a side to Amsterdam that remains hidden in the shadows, an unsettling, terrifying past. Today, we're diving into one of the scariest stories you've probably never heard of. This tale takes us to Amsterdam's oldest prison, a place where horrors beyond imagination unfolded, and where the whispers of the past still echo through the streets. A prison was established centuries ago, long before Amsterdam became the cultural and commercial hub it is today. It wasn't just any old facility for criminals. It was infamous for its brutal, unforgiving treatment of prisoners. The prison's walls, thick and imposing, were constructed to hold not just the guilty, but the innocent as well, swept up in the tides of corruption and injustice. Within these cold, stone walls, people were subjected to unimaginable punishments, torture, starvation, and forced confessions. Many who entered never came out. The air in the prison was heavy with the scent of fear and despair, the silence broken only by the faint, haunting sounds of anguished cries reverberating through the stone corridors. But amidst all the suffering, one particular scream stood out. Willem, a man whose name has been lost to the annals of history, was one of the many whose lives were forever altered by the grim, inhumane practices of the prison. He wasn't a murderer. He wasn't a thief. No, Willem was a victim of a corrupt system, a scapegoat, an innocent man who had been falsely accused and condemned. The crime he was accused of was never clear, and in a city ruled by power and fear, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that Willem's fate had been sealed. The evidence against him was fabricated, the trial unfair. But despite his pleas, the authorities cared little for the truth. They had a man to punish, and Willem would bear the brunt of their cruelty. His punishment began almost immediately upon entering the prison. They didn't waste any time. His screams filled the dark hallways as the guards set to work, subjecting him to cruel and horrific forms of torture designed to break his spirit, his body, and his will. For days, Willem was subjected to unspeakable pain. They whipped him until his skin was raw, burned him with hot irons, and subjected him to waterboarding, drowning him over and over again, only to bring him back to life, just as the life in his eyes began to fade. Each moment was more excruciating than the last, and each time he thought he could no longer bear it, the torture would continue. But what made Willem's suffering even more unbearable was the fact that he knew he was innocent. He had done nothing wrong. He had no reason to be here, no reason to face this hellish nightmare. He cried out for mercy, begged for someone, anyone to listen, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The guards were unmoved by his suffering. The system that condemned him was indifferent to his pain. He was nothing more than another cog in the wheel of an unjust, broken system. Days turned into weeks. Willem's body was battered, bruised, and broken. Yet through it all, his spirit remained unyielding. He refused to admit to a crime he hadn't committed. The prison walls seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with despair, But still he held on. His strength became a legend among the prisoners. They spoke of him in hushed tones, of his refusal to break, of his will to survive despite everything the prison had thrown at him. Some even claimed that they could hear him muttering in the night, whispering to himself, holding on to the belief that the truth would somehow find its way into the world. But eventually, even the strongest will can be broken. As the days stretched on, Willem's resolve began to crumble. The torture, the isolation, and the constant physical and mental abuse took their toll on him. His body became a shell of its former self, weak, emaciated, and unrecognizable. His mind, once sharp, began to fade, his thoughts growing confused and disjointed. But even in his weakened state, he still refused to confess to a crime he had never committed. It wasn't long before the authorities decided that Willem had been broken enough. They took him to a small, dark cell in the farthest corner of the prison, a place reserved for those who were considered unworthy of even the smallest shred of human decency. Here, in the suffocating darkness, Willem was left to die. No one came to his aid. No one cared. He was abandoned, a forgotten soul left to rot alone in a cold, damp cell. His final moments were spent in silence, with only the distant sound of other prisoners' muffled cries for company. But Willem's death wasn't the end of his story. Legend has it that his spirit did not rest. It did not fade into the nothingness of death. Instead, it lingered, it waited. Some say that his spirit became twisted with rage and sorrow, bound by the injustice that had been done to him. His soul, denied justice in life, would not find peace in death. The prison's dark halls, once echoing with the sounds of his tortured cries, became the place where his restless spirit would reside, forever searching for the answers that had been denied to him. It wasn't long before strange things began happening. Prisoners spoke of seeing a figure, a tall man, cloaked in shadow, with eyes that burned with an otherworldly glow. They said he moved through the prison at night, his presence chilling the very air around him. Some claimed that they could feel his eyes on them, watching, waiting. And then there were the whispers, the quiet, eerie whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first, they were faint, barely audible, but as the years passed, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They spoke of Willem, of his unjust fate, and of the anger that fueled his spirit. The prison, once a place of suffering, had become a place of something much darker, something vengeful. The haunting grew stronger with each passing year. Guards who worked the night shift claimed to hear footsteps in the empty halls, only to find no one there. Prisoners, alone in their cells, spoke of being visited by the shadowy figure of Willem. And on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the narrow windows, some claimed they could hear his voice, echoing through the dark corridors, crying out for justice. But despite the growing terror, no one dared to confront the spirit of Willem. His presence loomed over the prison, a silent reminder of the horrors that had taken place within those walls. And so the legend of Willem, the tortured soul, continued to grow, becoming a story whispered in the darkest corners of Amsterdam, one that few dared to speak of, and even fewer dared to believe. Yet his spirit remains, waiting for justice, waiting for the chance to finally rest. Days turned into months, and months turned into years. The prison continued its grim operations, its cold stone walls ever watchful of the prisoners that entered, never to leave. As time passed, the prison seemed to develop an eerie atmosphere, one that couldn't quite be explained away by simple superstition or the tired minds of those who had worked there for so long. The presence of something sinister, something wrong, lingered in the air, something that couldn't be ignored. At first, it was subtle. A creaking floorboard here, the faint echo of footsteps there. But soon, things began to escalate. Guards who had worked in the prison for years without incident began to hear things that shouldn't have been there. In the dead of night, long after the prisoners had been locked away in their cells, and the sounds of the prison had quieted down, guards would walk the halls, their boots clicking against the stone floors, only to hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps following them. When they turned, there was nothing there. At first, they assumed it was fatigue, the mind playing tricks after hours of solitary work in the dark halls. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, night after night, always keeping pace, always just behind them. It was as if someone, or something, was watching them, following them in the shadows. And it wasn't just the footsteps. As the months went on, the strange occurrences grew more disturbing. Cold drafts, despite the thick stone walls and the closed windows, would suddenly sweep through the cells. The air would grow thick and heavy, and the temperature would drop so low that the guards could see their breath fogging in front of them. The sensation was always brief, vanishing as quickly as it had come, but it was enough to make anyone working in the prison feel uneasy. No one could explain why the air felt colder at times, or why the temperature would suddenly change without warning. It was as if the prison itself had become alive, reacting to something unseen, something unknown. Then came the whispers. At first, the whispers were faint, barely audible over the sounds of the prisoners' murmurs and the guards' boots on the stone floors. But as the months turned into years, the whispers grew louder. Guards who worked the late shift reported hearing a voice in the walls, coming from deep within the prison's dark heart. The voice was always the same, low, guttural, filled with pain and sorrow. It sounded as though it was trapped, buried deep beneath the layers of stone and mortar, unable to escape. But it wasn't the voice of a prisoner, nor was it the voice of a guard. It was a voice that seemed to belong to something otherworldly. Willem's voice. The whispers became more distinct over time, though they were never clear enough to make out the words. They seemed to slither through the walls, curling around the ears of those who walked the halls at night. Prisoners began to hear it as well. When the lights went out and the silence of the night fell heavy over the cells, they would lie awake, staring into the darkness, trying to ignore the faint murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. The whispers didn't have the comfort of being just figments of the mind. They were real, tangible, and they carried a weight of grief and anger that pressed on the soul. At first, the prisoners didn't know what to make of it. They assumed it was just another trick of the mind, a product of fear, isolation and the endless days of confinement. But as the whispers became more persistent, they realized something darker was at work. Many claimed to have heard the whispers calling their names, a soft, almost pleading voice that seemed to come from the very walls around them. They would lie frozen in their beds, too terrified to move, too terrified to call for help. And when the whispers reached their ears, they could feel their hearts racing, their skin prickling with fear. It was as though something was trying to communicate with them from beyond the grave, a voice that could not be ignored. And then there were the sightings. At first, it was only the occasional glimpse of something, just a shadow in the corner of a guard's alley, a movement that didn't quite belong. But as the years dragged on, the sightings became more frequent, more undeniable. Prisoners, lying in their cells in the dead of night, began to claim they saw something, a figure standing at the end of their cells, watching them from the shadows. The figure was tall, with glowing eyes that burned with an unearthly light. Some prisoners would swear that they could feel its gaze, even when they closed their eyes. The presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on their chest, choking the breath out of them. The figure never moved. It simply stood there, watching, waiting. Its eyes never left its prey. And when the prisoners tried to scream, to call for help, they found that their voices wouldn't come. They were frozen, trapped in a nightmare that they couldn't escape. The figure, though it never seemed to approach, was always just there, always waiting, always watching. The guards, too, began to notice the strange figure. They spoke of a shadow that seemed to follow them wherever they went. It was always in their peripheral vision, always lurking, just out of sight. But when they turned to look, it would vanish into the darkness. No one could. As time went on, these strange events began to affect the prison in ways that no one could have predicted. The guards became nervous, jumpy. They would hesitate before entering the prison's darkest corners, afraid of what they might find lurking there. Prisoners began to act out, their behavior growing more erratic as the whispers and the sightings took their toll on their sanity. Many would claim that the figure, whatever it was, had begun to follow them, too. They spoke of it in hushed tones, terrified of even mentioning it out loud. Some of them even claimed that they could hear the sound of chains dragging along the floor in the dead of night, as if someone was moving through the halls, searching for something or someone to claim. But it wasn't until one fateful night that everything changed. That night, everything escalated. A new guard had just been assigned to the night shift, fresh and eager, unaware of the prison's dark history. He walked through the halls, his boots echoing in the silence, unaware of the cold draft that had begun to creep through the cells. He had heard the rumors, of course, about the footsteps, the whispers, the figure with the glowing eyes. But he didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in legends. That was until he saw it. It was standing at the far end of the hall, just beyond the reach of the dim light from the flickering lanterns. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by one of the old wooden beams that lined the ceiling. But as he drew closer, The figure became clearer. It was tall, far taller than any man he had ever seen, and its eyes glowed an unnatural shade of yellow, like two burning embers in the darkness. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, staring at the guard with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. For a moment he froze. His heart raced in his chest, and his hands went clammy. He opened his mouth to shout, but no sound came out. He tried to take a step forward, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if he was paralyzed, trapped by the figure's gaze. Then, without warning, the figure began to move. It wasn't fast. It didn't rush toward him, but it began to drift toward him, as if gliding through the air, its feet never touching the ground. The air grew colder, and the whispers, the same whispers that had haunted the prison for years, grew louder. The guard could feel the presence of something terrible, something beyond human, closing in on him. And that's when everything went black. The next morning, the guard was found unconscious, his body cold and pale, lying in the middle of the hallway. He had no memory of what had happened, but when he awoke, the terror in his eyes was unmistakable. He had seen something that could not be explained by logic or reason. And from that night on, the prison was never the same. A new guard, fresh-faced and eager to prove himself, had been assigned to the night shift at the infamous prison. His name was Michael, and he had heard all the rumors, of course. He knew the stories the other guards whispered when the night grew quiet, and the shadows stretched long across the walls. He'd heard about the footsteps that followed you in the dark, the cold drafts that would creep through the cells, and of course, the figure with glowing eyes, Willem, they said. Some of the older guards talked about it in hushed tones, a mixture of fear and reverence in their voices, as though speaking the name of the spirit would somehow bring it closer. But Michael wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood where superstition wasn't given the time of day. People didn't get haunted, they got by. Ghosts didn't walk the earth. They were just stories to keep children in line. He was a practical man, and he saw no reason to be afraid of things he couldn't see, things that didn't make sense. So, when he was given the job at the prison, he didn't think twice. It was just another night shift at a place full of criminals, a place that was no different from any other. On his first night, Michael felt a sense of pride. He'd been told it was a position most others avoided, but to him, it was an opportunity to prove himself, prove that he was brave, capable, and not easily spooked. He walked through the halls, the sound of his boots echoing off the stone walls as he began his rounds, checking the cells. The air was damp and stale, a constant reminder of the building's age. But it was quiet. Too quiet, in fact. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if the very prison itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But Michael didn't let it faze him. He checked the locks, ensured everything was secure, and moved on. As he made his way through the winding corridors, he passed by the older cells first, the ones that had been in use for decades, the ones with rusted bars and rotting wood. He knew the stories, how prisoners who had been in these cells for years spoke of hearing voices at night, the whispers of tortured souls begging for release. But Michael wasn't one to buy into that. He was focused on his job. The cold air didn't bother him, nor did the odd creaks of the floorboards. He was in control. But as he turned a corner to head down one of the longer hallways, something changed. The air, which had been stale, seemed to grow heavier. The temperature dropped suddenly, causing Michael to shiver. He saw his breath fog in front of him, despite the fact that the room should have been warm enough to avoid that. He frowned and pulled his jacket tighter around him, trying to ignore the discomfort settling in his bones. But then, the unmistakable sensation of being watched washed over him. He froze mid-step, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the cold. It was something else. The silence seemed to deepen, the stillness pressing against him like a weight. And then he saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the dim pool of light cast by his lantern. The shape was vague, barely there, just a dark silhouette against the stone walls. It was too far away to make out any details, but its presence was undeniable. The air around it seemed to warp, bending and twisting in a way that made Michael's stomach churn. His heart began to race. He told himself it was nothing. Just a trick of the light, maybe. A shadow cast by one of the old beams in the ceiling. Or perhaps an illusion brought on by the cold. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, his instincts screamed at him to turn around and run. The shadow didn't move, but its very stillness was unsettling. It was as if it was waiting for something, or worse, waiting for him. He took a cautious step forward, his boots scraping against the cold stone floor. The shadow didn't shift. It remained exactly where it was, its form as unmoving as the walls around it. Michael hesitated, his mind racing, his breath fogged in front of him again, but this time he didn't ignore it. This time the chill in the air felt different. He felt it settle into his chest, creeping into his lungs, making it harder to breathe. It was suffocating. The shadow, still motionless, seemed to loom over him, stretching and curling like smoke in the corner of his vision. It was no longer a shadow. It had grown. The form was taller now, its outline more defined. The air seemed to thicken around it, pressing in on Michael. His heart pounded, his legs heavy with the desire to turn and run. But he couldn't. He couldn't move. Something in the air was keeping him frozen, keeping him in place, as though the very floor was holding him captive. And then, without warning, it moved. It didn't rush toward him. It didn't charge, nor did it make any noise. It simply glided forward, moving like a shadow in the night, its presence growing more tangible with every inch it closed between them. Michael's breath caught in his throat as the shadow drew closer. He couldn't look away. He couldn't move. His body screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The figure was now so close that Michael could feel its coldness, the chill that radiated from it, seeping into his skin, freezing him to the bone. It was only a few feet away now, and Michael could make out the faintest glint in the dark. 2 bright, glowing eyes. They were cold, burning with an unnatural light that pierced through the darkness. They fixed on him, unblinking, as if they could see into his very soul. Michael felt his heart stop. He tried to scream, to shout for help, but no sound came. His mouth was dry, his throat closing up as terror surged through his veins. He was paralyzed, frozen in place, unable to do anything but stare into the glowing eyes of whatever this thing was. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. It didn't fade away, didn't retreat into the dark. It simply disappeared, leaving behind nothing but an empty hallway and the sickening feeling of dread that clung to the air. Michael stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving, his heart hammering in his chest. The cold continued to gnaw at him, and he could still feel the weight of the eyes that had watched him. His legs trembled beneath him, and finally, his body obeyed. He stumbled backward, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his radio, trying to call for help, but his voice was weak, a mere whisper against the silence. He didn't make it far before the overwhelming fear took over. He collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, unable to tear his eyes away from the spot where the shadow had been. His mind raced. What had he seen? What was that thing? He could no longer rationalize it away, no longer dismiss it as a trick of the light. It was real, and it had been waiting for him. The next morning, Michael was found dead in his cell. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, his eyes wide open, staring unseeing at the ceiling. He had been alive the night before. His colleagues had seen him walking the halls, heard him on the radio. But now, he was gone. His body was cold, his limbs stiff, and the only thing left behind was an eerie silence. His fellow guards couldn't explain it. He had been fine when they left him. Now, he was nothing but a shell. The prison, once again, was left with an unsettling stillness, and the legend grew. Another life had been claimed, another soul lost to the restless spirits that lingered within the prison's walls. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the eyes continued to watch. Word of Michael's death spread quickly through the prison, though no one dared to speak of it aloud. Those who worked the night shift now whispered in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as they moved through the darkened hallways. There was a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to weigh down on everyone, a sense of dread that lingered in the very air. The few who dared to talk about the events surrounding Michael's death did so with trepidation, as if by simply acknowledging the horrors, they might be next. But the rumors spread like wildfire, creeping from cell to cell, from guard to guard. The prison, it was said, was cursed, and the restless spirit of Willem had finally claimed another victim. The whispers about Willem's ghost grew louder, more insistent. Some of the older guards, who had worked in the prison for decades, would mutter under their breath as they passed by the dimly lit cells, their eyes darting nervously to the shadows that clung to the walls. Others spoke of the curse that seemed to have taken hold of the prison, how the spirits of those who had been tortured, abused, and killed there refused to rest. They said that Willem's spirit was angry, vengeful, and that he was waiting for the right moment to strike. Some even swore they had heard his voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable, whispering in the dark corners of the prison. But the hauntings didn't stop there. They only grew worse. It wasn't long before more guards were attacked in the dead of night, each incident more horrifying than the last. One guard, a man named Thomas, was found the next morning with deep scratch marks all over his body. The scratches were not just superficial, they were brutal, tearing through his skin as though something had clawed at him from the inside out. His face was a mask of terror, his eyes wide open in fear, as if he had seen something unimaginable just before he died. The room where Thomas had been stationed was empty, save for the marks, and the faint smell of something foul lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. No one could explain it. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of how Thomas had been attacked. It was as though the very walls had reached out to claim him. Another guard, a young woman named Sarah, vanished entirely. She had been on her regular rounds when she simply disappeared. When her colleagues went to check on her, all they found was a trail of blood leading into the prison's darkest corner, a part of the building that had long been abandoned and left to rot. The blood spattered across the floor, as though she had been dragged. But when they reached the corner, there was nothing. No body. No sign of Sarah. Just the blood and an overwhelming sense of dread that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. It was as though she had vanished into thin air, swallowed by the darkness itself. The rumors intensified. Some said that Willem had taken Sarah's soul, just as he had taken Michael's. Others believed that the prison itself had become a living entity, feeding off the fear and pain of those who entered. But no one could explain the disappearances or the attacks. It was as though something evil had taken root in the very heart of the prison. As the nights wore on, the hauntings grew even more intense. The prisoners, who had long since grown accustomed to the sounds of creaking wood, the rattling of bars, and the distant footsteps of the guards, began to panic. They spoke of strange noises in their cells, whispers that called their names, scraping sounds that seemed to come from inside the walls. At night, when the rest of the prison was silent, many prisoners would lie awake, their eyes wide open, straining to hear the faintest sound. They would hear scratching that seemed to come from deep within the walls themselves. Some prisoners, in their desperation, began to speak of a figure that haunted their dreams. A tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes that seemed to appear in the corners of their cells. They would see it standing just outside their bars, its eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made their blood run cold. The figure never moved, never spoke, but its presence was undeniable. It was as though it was waiting for something, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Some prisoners even claimed that they could feel its gaze on them when they closed their eyes, as though the figure was always there, lurking in the dark, waiting for them to make a mistake. At first, the prisoners were hesitant to speak openly about what they had seen. They were afraid of being labeled insane, afraid of the guards thinking they were making up stories. But as the sightings grew more frequent and the whispers grew louder, more and more prisoners began to speak out. They said that the figure they had seen in the dark was Willem, the tortured soul who had never found peace. They said that his spirit had come back to claim what had been taken from him, that his anger had grown too powerful to be contained within the prison walls. The figure with glowing eyes, they claimed, was not just a shadow. It was Willem himself, waiting for the moment when he would take revenge on those who had wronged him. Every night, the air in the prison seemed to grow colder, and the prisoners could feel it. The chilling presence of something malevolent moving through the halls. The cries of the tortured could still be heard, echoing through the empty corridors. The sound of chains rattling and screams of pain that seemed to come from nowhere. The once quiet halls now seemed to be alive with whispers, with the sounds of things that couldn't be explained. Some prisoners claimed to hear the voice of Willem, his tortured cries rising from the depths of the prison's darkened corners. Others said that they could feel his presence, standing just behind them, waiting for the moment when he would claim them as his own. The guards, too, were not immune to the effects of the haunting. They began to grow more nervous, more fearful. Their patrols became erratic, and they would often avoid certain areas of the prison, especially those near the abandoned wings where the sightings were most frequent. They had no answers, no explanations for what was happening. All they knew was that something dark and terrifying was lurking within the prison's walls. And it was only a matter of time before it claimed more lives. The prison, once a place of punishment, had become a place of fear. No one felt safe anymore. The prisoners and guards alike lived in constant dread, unsure of when the next attack would come, or when the figure with the glowing eyes would appear once again. Some said it was a curse, a punishment for the horrors that had taken place within the prison's walls. Others believed it was the spirit of Willem, returning to take vengeance on those who had wronged him. But whatever it was, one thing was clear: the hauntings were not over. In fact, they were just beginning. And the prison, with its cold stone walls and its darkened corners, would never be the same again. As time passed, the prison was left to decay. The once proud structure, which had been a symbol of control and punishment, now stood abandoned. The gates that once clanged shut with finality were now rusted and hanging askew, the heavy iron doors creaking as the wind pushed them open and closed. The prison's crumbling stone walls seemed to sigh under the weight of years of neglect, as though the building itself had grown weary, succumbing to the darkness that had seeped into its bones. The once imposing structure, which had been the site of so many horrors, had now become a hollow shell of its former self, a reminder of the terrible past that lingered within its walls. The authorities had long since abandoned it, not due to the risk of prisoners escaping, but because the terror within had grown too great to ignore. The guards, once brave enough to patrol its corridors, had left. The last prisoners had been transferred, and the prison was now silent, save for the whispers of those who still dared to speak of its cursed past. The stories of the hauntings, the mysterious deaths, and the vengeful spirit of Willem continued to circulate, but no one was foolish enough to go near the place. The air around the prison was thick with an unshakable sense of dread, as though something dark and malevolent still lingered, waiting for the next victim. But there's something even darker to the story, something that no one had known, something hidden deep within the prison's very foundation. The truth, as it turns out, was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Willem wasn't the only one who had died in that hellish place. While his tortured soul had become the focal point of the prison's hauntings, there were others. Others who had been just as innocent, just as broken by the cruelty of the prison's guards and the corrupt system that ran it. These souls, too, had been tortured and murdered without mercy. They had suffered unimaginable pain, their lives snuffed out before they had a chance to seek justice. And like Willem, their spirits had become trapped within the prison, their anger and sorrow forever bound to the walls that had witnessed their torment. The whispers of these other spirits grew louder over the years, as the prison's abandonment allowed the truth to begin seeping through the cracks. Some say that these souls were more vengeful than Willem, their anger fueled by the injustice they had faced. They were trapped in a cycle of pain, their suffering never ending, and they waited for someone to set them free, but no one was brave enough to confront them, until a group of curious individuals determined to uncover the dark secrets of the prison decided to enter the abandoned structure. It was an odd group. Some were paranormal investigators, eager to document the haunting. Others were historians, fascinated by the prison's grim past. They had heard the stories, of course, but they didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until they could see the evidence with their own eyes. They set out to uncover the truth, to find out what lay beneath the rumors and the urban legends that had built up over the years. They ventured into the heart of the prison, armed with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of bravado that quickly faded as they made their way deeper into the structure. At first, the prison seemed silent. The air was thick with dust, and the long abandoned cells stood like empty tombs, their iron bars rusted with age. The walls were covered in grime, and the smell of mildew and decay hung in the air. As they moved from one room to the next, the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the shadows, sent a chill down their spines. But they pressed on, determined to find something, anything, that could explain the rumors, the strange occurrences, and the restless spirits that had haunted the place for so long. It wasn't long before they began to notice something disturbing. The cells, once empty and desolate, were now full of bloodstains. The crimson marks were smeared across the stone floors, the walls, and even the ceiling in places, as though someone, or something, had been dragged, beaten, and left to die. The remnants of old shackles were still attached to the walls, twisted and rusted, evidence of the suffering that had taken place here. Some cells still had remnants of the torture devices that had been used by the guards, implements of pain and suffering that had been discarded after the prison's closure. It was clear that the place had been a site of unimaginable cruelty, and the bloodstains were a testament to the horrors that had unfolded behind these walls. As they moved through the prison, the investigators began to feel a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the physical decay of the building, but something far more insidious, something they couldn't explain. The temperature seemed to drop as they ventured deeper into the prison, and the air grew thick and suffocating. The flickering lights cast long, grotesque shadows, and the silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. It felt as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing with the memories of the past, holding on to the pain and suffering that had been inflicted here. But the most horrifying discovery came when they found a hidden chamber beneath the prison. This chamber had been sealed for years, its entrance hidden behind a wall that had been hastily covered with debris and rubble. It wasn't until they dug through the layers of dust and old bricks that they uncovered the entrance to the chamber. A small door tucked away in the farthest corner of the prison. The investigators hesitated before entering, sensing that whatever lay within was not meant to be uncovered. But their curiosity pushed them forward, and they stepped into the darkened chamber, their flashlights flickering as they moved deeper into the space. What they found in the chamber was beyond anything they could have imagined. The room was small, its walls covered in ancient symbols and markings, as though something or someone had been using this space for rituals long ago. At the center of the room was a blood-soaked altar, its surface stained with the remnants of countless sacrifices. The altar was surrounded by remnants of old bones, rotting cloth, and pieces of shattered chains, items that had once been used to bind the souls of the tortured. The air in the chamber was thick with the scent of decay, and a sense of malevolence seemed to hang in the air, pressing against the investigators like a physical force. The altar, they soon realized, was the heart of the curse. It was here that the spirits of the tortured had been bound, trapped within the walls of the prison for all eternity. It was from this chamber that the hauntings had spread, the anger of the tortured souls leaking out into the rest of the building. The investigators could feel the weight of the spirits pressing against them, their anger and pain still lingering in the air, refusing to be forgotten. It was in that moment that they realized the full extent of the prison's curse. Willem's spirit, though powerful, was only one of many. The souls of those who had suffered before him, those who had been tortured, killed, and abandoned by a corrupt system, were trapped in the prison, bound to the altar and to the walls of the building itself. Their suffering had never ended, and it never would. The altar was a prison of its own, holding their souls captive, feeding off their anger and despair, growing stronger with each passing year. The investigators tried to leave, but the air in the chamber had become suffocating, and the temperature had dropped to freezing. They could feel the spirits pressing against them, their presence overwhelming. As they made their way back through the dark hallways, they could hear the faintest whispers, voices calling their names, begging for release. They ran, desperate to escape, but it was clear to them now that the prison was not just haunted, it was cursed, and the curse had no end. The walls, the cells, the bloodstains, they were all part of the prison's dark secret, and it was a secret that would never be revealed to the world, not until it was too late. The prison, once a towering fortress of suffering, was eventually torn down. The city had grown, and new developments were needed to meet the demands of the modern world. The stone walls that had witnessed centuries of torment were dismantled, brick by brick, leaving behind nothing but rubble and twisted remnants of a dark history. But even as the physical structure crumbled to dust, the lingering presence of the prison's tortured past refused to fade. The bones of the prison were left to rot, but the spirit of Willem and the countless others who had suffered within its walls, they were still out there, still bound to the site, still tethered to the cursed grounds where so much pain had been inflicted. For years, the site lay abandoned, its dark reputation growing with each passing decade. People who ventured too close to the ruins claimed to have seen strange things. Figures moving in the shadows, fleeting glimpses of shapes that seemed to watch from the corners of their vision. The most common tale was of a tall man with glowing eyes standing in the distance just beyond the rubble. His figure was always tall and imposing, his eyes burning with an unnatural light, like twin embers flickering in the dark. He never spoke. He never moved. He simply watched, his gaze locked onto anyone who dared to come near. The air around him seemed to grow colder, the atmosphere thickening with a sense of dread that made it impossible to stay for long. And as quickly as the figure appeared, it would vanish, disappearing into the shadows where it could never be caught, never be fully understood. The locals had their theories. Some believed that the spirit of Willem had not been the only one trapped by the prison's curse. Others insisted that the vengeful souls of those who had suffered there were still seeking retribution. For many years, the ruins were a place to avoid, a place where the past refused to stay buried. The tall figure with glowing eyes became the stuff of nightmares, a figure that seemed to be the embodiment of the prison's violent history. But despite the fear, people couldn't help but be drawn to the site, compelled by the whispers of what might lie within the ruins, by the stories of the restless spirits that still haunted the ground. And then there were the few brave, or perhaps foolish, souls who dared to visit the site, desperate to uncover the truth. Paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and even historians who had heard the stories ventured into the ruins with cameras, recording devices, and the hope of witnessing something that would prove the legend to be true. But no one who entered the ruins ever returned unchanged. Some of them claimed to have heard whispers in the wind, faint voices calling out from the depths of the rubble, voices that seemed to be begging for release. Others spoke of the overwhelming feeling of being watched, a presence that loomed over them, never leaving their side, making every step feel like a march towards certain doom. But what no one could answer was this: what would happen if the curse was ever broken? If Willem's spirit and the spirits of all those who had been tortured were finally freed from their eternal prison, what would become of them? Would they find peace at last? Their suffering finally at an end? Or would their vengeful hunger be unleashed upon the world, their wrath a storm too powerful to contain? There were some who believed that Willem's spirit was more than just a lingering presence. It was a force of nature, a spirit so consumed by anger that its very existence had become a manifestation of vengeance. Some said that the curse had been set in motion the moment Willem had been wrongfully condemned, and that until his spirit found justice, the curse would never be broken. But what kind of justice could possibly satisfy such a tortured soul? What could repay the years of suffering, the days and nights of unimaginable pain, the despair of an innocent man trapped in a cycle of torment? Theories about the curse circulated for years. Some believed that if someone could uncover the true story of what had happened within the prison's walls, if the truth could finally be revealed, the spirits would be set free. Others insisted that only a sacrifice could end the curse, that the blood of an innocent soul must be spilled to appease the restless spirits. Still, others said that the curse would only end when the spirit of Willem was confronted, when someone stood before him and demanded his release from the prison of his own making. But no one knew for sure. All anyone could do was speculate, to wonder what would happen if the curse was ever broken, and to fear that the consequences might be too great to imagine. As the years passed, the sight of the prison slowly faded from public consciousness. The ruins became overgrown with weeds, the crumbling stone walls buried beneath layers of dirt and decay. But the stories never died. They persisted, passed down through generations, each new telling adding more detail, more terror. And in the back of people's minds, a question lingered. What if someone did break the curse? What if Willem's spirit was finally released? One evening, many years after the prison had been torn down, a group of daring individuals, an odd mix of paranormal enthusiasts and thrill seekers, gathered at the site of the ruins. They were determined to uncover the truth once and for all, to find out what lay hidden beneath the crumbled stone and broken remnants of the prison. They had heard the stories, seen the eerie figure with glowing eyes, and felt the pull of curiosity and fear. They had no idea what they were about to face. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of bravado, they explored the site, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dirt and moss that had overtaken the area. As they made their way deeper into the ruins, the air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around them. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as though 1,000 eyes were locked onto them, hidden in the shadows. The wind howled through the broken windows, and the sound of chains rattled in the distance, an echo of the prison's tortured cast. It was then that they saw him, the tall figure with glowing eyes, standing just at the edge of the ruins. His form was more solid now, more real than any of them had expected. He was tall, impossibly tall, with a silhouette that seemed to stretch toward the heavens. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, burning through the darkness like two fiery orbs. The group froze, their hearts racing in their chests as they stared at the figure. They didn't dare move. They couldn't. The air around them thickened, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. The figure didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to send terror coursing through their veins. And then, without warning, the figure began to move, his body gliding through the ruins with a fluid, unnatural grace. The group backed away, their fear growing with each passing second, until they reached the edge of the ruins, where the darkness swallowed them whole. But even as they fled, the figure continued to watch. His eyes never left them, following their every movement. They couldn't escape. The curse, it seemed, was far from over. What would happen if Willem's spirit were ever freed? Would he find peace? Or would he return to claim more souls, his thirst for vengeance unquenched? No one knew the answer. But one thing was certain. The spirit of Amsterdam's oldest prison was not done yet. and anyone who dared to step foot near its cursed grounds might just become the next victim of its bloodshed.